Welcome to another day of puzzle solving. So today, we will have 5 puzzles to solve, and it is black to move in this position. Once again, let's define our method. So, in the first place, we have to look at all the checks. You have to look at all the captures that exist in the position. Then we have to look at all the moves which make aggressive contact with white's position. So, let's begin here. So black has several checks here that exist. So queen c1 check, queen d1 check, queen d2 check, queen takes on c3 would check, queen takes on f2 would check, queen to e2 would check, and bishop d2 check is another check here. Now let's look at all the captures that exist. Of course, don't forget knight takes on b1 check is also a possibility here. So now let's move on to all the captures. Oh, knight takes on, queen takes on e4 check as well. So let's watch out for that. Captures out. So we have some nonsense type of captures that exist here, namely bishop takes on h2. And I believe these are all the captures that are without check, right? We've already considered the captures with check. Now let's move on to the most aggressive contact. So bishop queen d3 seems like a nonsense move. Queen e7, right? We have to move off from the queen, then the rooks, then the bishops and knights, and then finally the pawns. So follows that queen b2, queen b3, applying pressure to the pawn on a2, and queen b2 is applying pressure to the rook on a1, and the bishop on c3, for instance. Of course, these are all nonsense moves. Nevertheless, according to our protocol, we have to consider all moves and exhaust all possibilities. This allows us to take in and understand the position holistically, and perhaps find some nuances and even some hidden brilliancies that exist. So we've already considered something like queen e2, and what else? Queen a4. Certainly just apply more pressure on a2. I think that's about it with the queen. So with the rook, we cannot do much. And let's look at all the minor pieces now. Bishops and knights, start with the light squares. So attacking the light squares here. So bishop a6 takes the bishop on f1. What else? Knight. So knight may go knight e5 or knight d4. So applying pressure on the knight here on f3. This knight cannot really move here since it's pinned to the king. And what about the dark square bishop now? So bishop e5 is certainly one move here. Bishop e6 is another move here. Perhaps we need to take on f2. So bishop e3 rather. Right? And what else? Bishop g3 does similar. And finally, we have to move on to the pawns. So pawn f5, certainly pawn d4. So the moves which make aggressive contact. And now that we've exhausted all of our possibilities, we may have noticed some nuances along the way, some ideas that were hidden. And we go on to the analysis. So let's start off with the most forcing mind first. All right. So how forcing is queen to d1 check? So queen d1 check, there is only actually one move, namely queen takes, or king takes queen. Right? And is there adequate? Is there a good follow-up? For black, I do not see it. And the queen is ready, queen takes on g8. So what about queen to c1 check? Queen c1 check. Well, there's actually only one move. King must go to e2. So really on the right track. After king after king e2, then what? Well, perhaps bishop a6 would check, which is another check. Very forceful. And this looks like his checkmate, to be honest. Right, so she visualized this. Can the king, no, the king cannot move here. So consequently, this has to be correct. So we already found our checkmate combination just by looking at this forcing line. So let's try to solve the puzzle now. We said queen c1 check, king e2, and then bishop a6 is checkmate. Excellent. Now let's move on to the next puzzle. So that move, our method defined is look for the checks first, then look for the captures, then look for the moves which make aggressive contact with white's position. So let's start with all the checks. So queen a5 check, bishop b4 check, it's another check here. And I believe that's it. Looks close to all the checks. Let's look at all the captures. Queen takes knight on d4. Check is a capture. Queen takes on g2 is a capture. And where else? Bishop takes on a3 is a capture. And I believe we've exhausted most of the captures that exist. Okay, now let's move on to the, we'll just make the aggressive contact, starting with the queen, then the rooks, and then the bishop and knights, and then finally the pawns. So queen e4 applies pressure to the bishop. Of course, in addition to applying pressure to the knight, certainly. Then the nonsense moves that exist like queen f3, queen b6, queen b3 rather, b3. So it's having this queen, this pawn, even this a move as crazy as queen a2 here. Here we can just quickly eliminate these moves in the analysis phase. And what else? I mean, you can go queen g5. There are many possibilities that will let nonsense moves. Nevertheless, you must all consider, let's consider all of them, right? Queen e5 is also another move here. Finally, you can move on to the rooks. Rooks cannot really do much to make contact with white's position. Let's look at all the bishops now. Start with the light squares. So light squares, so we've only one possibility, namely bishop d7, which doesn't do much. Let's look at all the pieces on the dot squares. Dot square, bishop here, knight here, what can they do? So knight, for instance, knight c6, attacking the knight on d4. Bishop to d6, attacking the bishop. Bishop to c4, c5, attacking the knights here. And this knight, apologies for that, knight h5, attacking the bishop. So really knight e4, that's applying pressure to f2. And finally, we move on to the pawn moves. So e5 is one pawn move. It makes aggressive contact. g5 is another pawn move. It makes aggressive contact. And we need not consider other moves here. So let's start with the most forcing lines. Bishop b4 check. Very forcing. Pawn takes bishop. Then what? I don't see any check that will come from that position. We want to capture. Queen takes. So it's not very clear. Yeah, we can eliminate this move. What other check exists? So queen a5 check. It's really doing anything after b4. That's before we can just take here. Pawn takes bishop checks. This pawn cannot take back since it's pinned. Since it's pinned, and the rook would be on pre in this case. So queen a5 check. Then I believe white can simply develop here. Or at the very least, can counterattack with bishop to d2. Attacking queen again. So this is toothless. Captures. Okay, we can easily eliminate this capture here. Right, there's no good follow-up after queen takes on g2, and bishop takes on a3. So the something knight takes with development, and there's really not much that I see again. Okay. So which moves do we say attack here? Bishop. This is very forceful. Perhaps knight comes. And then queen takes queen, check. Or even bishop takes one. Bishop takes on f7. Oh, f2 rather. f2. This will remove a king, right? And the queen will be on pre. So this is a very interesting line. So bishop c5. How do you respond to this? So then there may be possibilities if bishop b6 is another possibility, or even something like e3 followed by knight up to c3. Right, attacking the queen. So bishop c5 is not very forcing. Bishop d3. So the bishop takes bishop. Okay. And of course this move here. You can simply take knight takes knight. So let's look at the pawn moves. e4, e5 rather, e5 simply is a fork, right? Forking motif, and we should be winning material here, or threatening material. So like e5, if knight to c3 to attack the queen is a last-ditch effort, then we can take. What about queen coming out to a4 check here after e5? So we can just attack the queen, bishop d7, attack the queen, and we can win material. So e5 is a move that we've considered before, and I believe it's winning material. So let's try to solve this puzzle now. Simply e5, and after knight c3, we said we're just going to take queen takes d4, and pawn takes queen, and we are up material here. We got 4 minor pieces to black's white's 3 minor pieces. So let's move on and solve the next puzzle. I'd like to move, find all the checks, get all the captures, get all the moves that make towards the contact. So here with black, rook takes on g2 check, rook takes on f1 check is another check. So any rook move here that moves would have unmasked this bishop would be a check. So any move along to this rank or along this file should be a check. These are all the checks that we can consider. And then with the queen, say queen takes h2 check is one possibility. And what else? So I believe that's it. Move on to all the captures here. So we've already considered the captures with check, so we can eliminate those. So bishop takes c5, it's one capture. And I believe that is the only capture that doesn't really come with check. Okay. Let's move on to the moves straight reserve contact here. So the queen first, then go to the rooks and the bishops, and then finally the pawns. So something like queen f3, applying pressure to the bishop on f1, queen f6 right up, queen e7, applying pressure to the ruler and knight on e4. And nonsense moves here like queen h3, queen g3, and then some bishop moves, some rook moves first, right? You can just go queen discovered check, right? Attacking the queen here. And just some rook moves here along this rank, they all apply pressure, in a sense, except for this one. And something like rook f4 would check applies pressure to the knight. Okay, let's look at the bishop moves. So bishop e2 or bishop e6. These apply pressure. Bishop f5 applies pressure to the knight again. So bishop f3 applies pressure to the pawn on g2 and the knight on e4. And a crazy move like bishop to d1 also applies pressure to the pawn on a4. These look like very silly moves, right, to consider, but they must be considered nevertheless. They must exhaust all the possibilities and habituate this kind of thinking. And then finally, pawn moves, pawn a5. These moves on really attack. And pawn b, so pawn b6 or pawn b5 is a move that makes aggressive contact, and pawn a5 is a move that makes aggressive contact. So now that we've gotten those, good stuff with the most forceful lines that we can find. And typically the most forceful lines are the checks. So what about rook takes on g2 check? So rook takes on g2 check. Actually, there's only one move here. Because this is a double check. The king has to move. And the king has to take here. So king takes. And it's very close to checkmate already. So perhaps queen h3 check. There is only one move, namely king h1. Since you cannot move back to g1 since the bishop is here. So for king h1, then what? Then perhaps bishop f3 check. And now the king is completely in the corner. There's only one move to defend against the checkmate, namely bishop g2 for white. And then we can go bishop takes bishop checkmate or queen takes bishop checkmate. So already this line is very forcing. Right, what about rook takes on f1 double check? So rook takes f1 double check, so now king has to flee. And it's not so easy to find an immediate follow-up with check. So queen f6 check, yeah, it's not. So then you can just go knight takes queen and queen to f2. So it is out of a question again, knight takes queen. So the fastest way to checkmate must certainly be rook takes on g2 check. So let's try to solve this puzzle now. So rook takes on g2, queen h3 check, only one move, and then finally bishop f3 check. And the next move will be checkmate, right? So we can take here from g2 with either the queen or the bishop, and that will checkmate. So let's move on to the next puzzle. So in this case, back to move. Let's define our method. Our method is to find all the checks and then all the captures. No, the most made aggressive contact for white. So all the checks simplifying. Bishop g2 check. Queen takes on e5, e4 check rather. So queen f3 check is also another check. And those are all the checks. I believe those are all the checks, and then all the captures. So queen takes e2 is a capture. Queen takes on g3 is a capture. Bishop takes on g1 is a capture. What else? I believe that's it. In all the moves is rank aggressive contact. So with the queen, you typically have a lot of nonsense type of moves. So something like, I don't know. Well, the queen's already applying pressure to a lot of pieces, to a lot of pawns here in the position. Nevertheless, you must still consider all the queen moves which can make contact with white's position here. So something like queen e3, perhaps biting at a rock here on b3. So queen e6 rather. And some crazy move like queen f4. I'm not too sure what it's doing there, but it's still maintaining some kind of contact with the pawns on g3 and e4. So now that we've gotten that, let's see what the rook can do. So the rook can go to g1, perhaps applying further pressures here. Applying further pressure here on g3. And let's look at all the bishop moves now. All the light squares. Moves attacks the light squares, so we've already considered all the moves with the bishop. So bishop f1 is one move, which applies pressure to this bishop. So we've already considered bishop g2, as already mentioned. And at the knight you can go knight d5, applying pressure to the bishop on e2. Knight d4, applying pressure to bishop on e2, knight to b4, applying pressure to the pawns on c2 and a2. And now dark square bishop, so bishop f2 applies pressure, bishop d2 applies pressure, bishop d4 applies pressure on the bishop on b2, right? And then finally, we can go on to the knight moves, the pawn moves rather. So it's like pawn d5, pawn f5, and something like pawn to c5. It's important to note that with some of the contact moves, I might have missed some moves like bishop c1, for instance. But some of these moves are like nonsense moves that you can eliminate instantly, which we usually do that in the analysis phase, right? Just to make sure that they don't work and they don't, like some kind of hidden brilliancy. So continuing. Now we have so much of the analysis that we exhausted up one moves here. So let's begin. So all the moves give check, so this is a very forceful move. Bishop g2 check. King takes on g2, right? King e2 would be was not checkmate. So the king can take in two ways. So perhaps it's not the most fruitful line. Okay, what about queen takes on e4 check? So queen takes e4, the king can move, but it's checkmate here, so there's several ways to defend, namely knight f3, bishop f3. So bishop f3 attacks the queen is the immediate bishop check here. On g2 check, the king takes on g2, right? You've lost a great deal of our pieces, so perhaps this is not the best. And what about this one? Queen f3 check, then bishop takes, and the attack is over, since there's only a rook that can attack now. Right? This knight cannot come to the attack, it can be eliminated with ease. So the checks don't seem to work here. We're really capture. So bishop takes knight on g1, then bishop can take here with check. So this is a threat here that we have to be aware of. So this capture doesn't work. What about the capture that we considered here? Queen to g3 is very forceful. Well, it's trading checkmate in one. So it's very, very forceful. Say bishop f3, so if I have to defend against the checkmate on g2, then perhaps the rook can come again, renewing this threat. It's a very strong move. Yeah, after rook g1, it's very hard to find a move for white here. So perhaps something like queen to e2, queen, so what happens? After the queen e2, then bishop check. Bishop check, queen takes bishop. Sadly, it's not so easy. So let's see, queen g3, bishop out to f3. Then what about just going on with that idea of bishop to g2 chat anyway, to let bishop takes on bishop takes on g2 is meant with something like bishop f4 for his training checkmate again. So this is quite interesting. Actually, queen takes g3, you notice that bishop f5 is a possibility now, right? Just going through the analysis. So queen takes g3, bishop f3, then perhaps they might exist. There might actually exist these moves like bishop f5 and queen to g8. So let's see here. Queen takes, bishop f3, and notice that this puzzle is relatively difficult to solve. But what about simply backing up on queen h4. Now, queen h4 is very, very strong here. This threatening a discovered attack immediately and threatening checkmate. So there's queen h4. Discovered strong here. Knight takes is lost. And what about if queen goes to e2? So queen goes to e2 after queen h4. Queen goes to e2. Then perhaps we can go bishop e2, bishop g2 check anyway, bishop g2 check, so king takes, is forced, and then what? It's quite interesting actually. Perhaps queen h4, queen e2, then perhaps we can come up with this idea again, which is very, very strong now. Yes, this has to be correct, yeah. So this is actually a very, very complicated puzzle. But I believe queen h4 has to be the correct move, and if queen e2, for instance, then suddenly you can just go rook g1, and we have a lot of threats here. Bishop g2 check is a one threat, winning the queen at the very least. So I believe this has to be correct. I do not see any other immediate moves. So quite complex, but I believe this has to be right. So instead the computer opts for this as the optimal line, bishop g4 check, and so you can just go bishop takes bishop here. And of course, the queen's under attack, so bishop takes queen. Our queen would be on 3. So to avoid this, the simply go queen h4, which is a very key move in the position generally. And you can just go bishop takes rook, and we are material. And we're still draining checkmate, discover checkmate here. And the attack may continue with rook g8. Right, the king's very weak. So we should be either up material or checkmating very soon. Okay, let's move on to the final puzzle. That was very difficult. So here it's black to move. So let's look at all the checks, captures, and all the moves like aggressive contact. So the rook b8 check, rook 1 check, queen takes on, queen takes on c2 check. What else? I believe that's it. There's all the checks, and let's look at all the captures. So queen takes on c5, and one capture, knight takes on c2 is another capture, queen takes on f2, and then the capture. Rook gain capture here. I believe I've exhausted most of, if not all of the captures. Let's move on to all the moves which make aggressive contact now. So nonsense moves exist here. The queen d3, queen f3, queen h3, these are nonsense moves, but must be considered nevertheless. Queen d5, and then the other moves here that you can consider bishop g. Queen g4. Queen g4 applying pressure on b2, on g2, and on d1. Okay, so let's look at all the moves with the rook. Okay, we have the rook check, which we already considered. And the bishop moves. So bishop b7, attacking the pawn on g2. And then the knight moves. So knight b4. Knight b5 rather, knight b5, attacking the queen. Even knight e2, attacking the queen. So these are the moves we should consider. And finally, with the pawn moves, pawn moves can really make aggressive contact. So we may move on to the analysis phase. So the analysis phase, let's start with the most forceful one. So queen takes c2 check, probably reinforcing one rook. Or rook b8 check, is also very fortunate. So queen takes, bishop check, and the queen can recapture here. Is that the only move? Seems like it's the only move, since the queen would be lost if white does not take. So queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, knight takes, and then king takes knight, and we have two rooks for a minor piece of the rook, so this is not a favorable material advantage, so perhaps this is not the most forceful line. How about we try rook b8 check? So rook b8 check. If the king runs to c8, then this check here wins the queen, right? So king c1, knight e2 check, king d2, then knight takes on c2, and if white opts to take the queen back, winning material back, then we can just take here on d1, and we up material, and the bishop here is still under attack by this pawn. So it takes some visualization to see this. So after rook b8 check, we know that king c1 will certainly lose, where that leads to a loss of material. What about king a1? So after king a1, can simply take here with check, and actually the queen must be lost, since if the queen is not lost, that'll be checkmate. That'll be only a move to prevent checkmate. So this would win the queen, so this is a forced line. Right, bishop cannot defend on b3 because it's pinned. We pin to the king. Right. As we've got, there's a check along the h7, b1 diagonal. So consequently, rook b8 is the most forcing type of line that I can see here. Blocking with the queen is not an option here. Since blocking with the queen is an important defender of c2, if you block with a queen, you can simply take on c2 with check, at the very least. So this has to be correct. This wins material immediately. So let's try to solve the puzzle now. So b8 check, and then knight e2 check, then knight takes on c3, rather, that's c3 check, g3, and suddenly there's take on d1, and after taking on d1, we notice something. Material-wise, if white takes back, we can simply take pawn takes bishop, and we have a minor piece versus a rook alone, right? And we can just neglect the pawn card here. We should be able to win this endgame with relative ease. So those are the puzzles for today. So thank you very much. See, the second to last puzzle was very difficult, and I had to sort of go off script a little bit just to try to solve it. So it's very impromptu and unprepared. We simply just follow the method and we can solve the puzzles. We don't need preparation. So thank you very much.